The death of 22-year-old Freddie E. is a documented case of a live broadcasted psychological collapse. Triggered by a severe breakup, he experienced a severe depressive episode and turned to Twitter to document his rapid deterioration. On January 5, 2013, he live-tweeted his exact final moments, explicitly stating he had a rifle pressed to his head. Immediately after tweeting his final apologies to his family, he pulled the trigger, dying instantly. This is the cold reality of a digital audience watching a tragedy unfold in real time. The screen glows with the sterile, hypnotic blue light of a social media feed. It is a portal connecting millions of isolated individuals across the globe, a digital amphitheater where lives are broadcast, consumed, and instantly forgotten in the endless upward swipe of a thumb. Born on July 19, 1990, in Seattle, Washington, Frederick Eugene Boole, known to millions as Freddie E., had the world in the palm of his hands by age 22. With his striking looks, undeniable rap talent, and a booming YouTube channel, he projected the image of a vibrant, hilarious, and life-loving star. But beneath that flawless digital facade, a deadly storm was brewing. To the physical world around him, he was just a young man in a room. But through the lens of the internet, he was a giant. He was an entertainer, a musician, a poet, and above all, a highly effective generator of laughter. He commanded an audience of tens of thousands who tuned in specifically to watch him smile, to hear him joke, and to feel the infectious, radiant energy he projected into the camera lens. They looked at him and saw a young man who had successfully conquered the new frontier of internet fame. They saw a victor. But the fundamental fatal flaw of the digital era is that a screen only shows you exactly what the creator wants you to see. It crops out the darkness just beyond the frame. It mutes the deafening silence of an empty room once the recording stops. Frederick Boole was universally known to his massive dedicated digital following as Freddie E. Long before the highly sanitized, heavily corporate, and meticulously curated world of modern social media influencers. Freddie was a genuine pioneer of raw early internet culture. In the transitional years of the late 2000s and early 2010s, YouTube was still a wild, unpredictable landscape. Long before the dominance of massive production companies or algorithm-driven content farms, it operated as a raw platform where a charismatic kid with a cheap camera and a fast internet connection could build a genuine, highly engaged community entirely from scratch. Freddie recognized this potential and built a sprawling digital empire anchored by his wildly popular channel, Jerk TV. He did not need a casting director or a massive television network to validate his talent. He simply turned on his camera and spoke directly to his generation. He was magnetic. He possessed that rare, unteachable quality of immediate accessibility. Stripped of the aura of a distant, untouchable celebrity, watching a Freddie E. video felt exactly like hanging out with your funniest, most energetic friend. He was the quintessential class clown, armed with a rapid-fire wit, a deeply perceptive sense of observational humor, and a completely uninhibited physical energy. He produced comedic skits. He released spoken-word poetry that showcased a surprisingly deep intellect, and he recorded underground hip-hop tracks. But the absolute core of his brand, the primary engine driving his rapidly expanding fame, was his ability to make people laugh. He built an entire lucrative persona on being the guy who could instantly lighten the heavy, oppressive mood of daily life. He was the friend who always had a sharp joke ready, the entertainer who could pull a genuine smile from a cynical audience. He was a beacon of forced positivity. However, clinical psychology and the long tragic history of the entertainment industry have extensively documented a very dark, frequently fatal paradox surrounding individuals who dedicate their entire existence to manufacturing joy for others. The phenomenon of the class clown is rarely a manifestation of genuine, overflowing internal happiness. Far more often, it is a highly sophisticated, deeply entrenched psychological defense mechanism. For Freddie, comedy was not merely a genre of entertainment. It was a heavy, brightly painted suit of armor. It was a tactical shield deployed specifically to deflect attention away from a deeply fractured, agonizingly painful internal world. The architecture of this specific type of depression is built directly upon the underlying utility of a joke. When a person is drowning in a severe clinical depression, they frequently experience a profound loss of control over their own emotional state. They feel entirely powerless against the crushing, suffocating weight of their own mind. But making someone else laugh provides a sudden, powerful, and immediate surge of control. If you can manipulate the emotional state of a room, if you can force a crowd of people to smile on your command, you temporarily hijack reality. You create a fleeting artificial environment where you are in charge. Furthermore, the external validation of a laughing audience provides a rapid, intoxicating hit of dopamine, a chemical distraction that temporarily numbs the internal agony. The comedian becomes entirely addicted to the sound of laughter because it is the only sound loud enough to temporarily drown out the terrifying, relentlessly negative voices echoing inside their own head. Those who were genuinely close to Frederick, the very few individuals who were allowed to step behind the brightly lit set of Jerk TV and see the unvarnished reality of his daily existence, noted that he was a young man carrying an immense, unspoken emotional burden. When the camera was switched off and the performance was over, the radiant, energetic persona instantly evaporated, leaving behind a deeply exhausted, intensely vulnerable human being. He was fighting a shadow war against his own neurochemistry. But society is deeply conditioned to accept the mask without question. We are inherently selfish consumers of entertainment. We desperately want to believe that the people who bring us joy are joyful themselves, because to acknowledge their pain would ruin the illusion and force us to confront uncomfortable realities. We do not actively look for tragedy in our comedians. We demand that they remain in character. Because Freddie was always the one providing the laughter, his genuine, subtle cries for help were routinely completely dismissed as part of an elaborate act. When you look back at his extensive digital footprint today, stripped of the immediate context of comedy and viewed through the cold, clinical lens of hindsight, the warning signs were glaringly, terrifyingly obvious. They were hidden in plain sight, buried beneath the engagement metrics and the comment sections. In the background of his seemingly upbeat, high-energy videos, his physical environment frequently reflected a chaotic, darkened state. The lighting was often dim, the framing isolating. More importantly, in the quiet, unscripted microseconds between punchlines, his eyes frequently betrayed a hollow, devastating exhaustion. There is a specific vacant stare that accompanies severe, untreated depression, a look that suggests the body is present, but the spirit has already entirely vacated the premises. Freddie exhibited this stare repeatedly, but his audience was completely blinded by the blinding glare of his manufactured persona. When the man whose literal job is to tell jokes suddenly drops his voice and says he is dying, inside the audience does not reach for a phone to call for help. They simply pause, smile, and wait for the punchline. They assume it is a setup for a darker, more subversive piece of comedy. They assume it is a highly calculated performance of vulnerability designed to generate relatable content. The audience strips the artist of their fundamental humanity, reducing their genuine agony into mere content to be consumed. Freddie was screaming from the absolute bottom of a deep well, but because he used a microphone to do it, the world simply thought he was testing the acoustics. The profound evergreen truth buried within the early years of Freddie E.'s career is a harsh, uncompromising lesson about the nature of modern success. We are collectively sold a highly toxic, entirely false narrative that fame, financial stability, digital followers, and the ability to command the attention of a room serve as absolute antidotes to mental illness. We are taught to believe that if we can simply accumulate enough external validation, the internal darkness will magically evaporate. Frederick Buhl proved that this is a lethal lie. Depression does not care about your subscriber count. It does not care about your talent, your charisma, or your youth. It is a relentless biological predator that can easily bypass the strongest external defenses. Freddie proved that the individuals radiating the brightest, most intense light are frequently the ones standing closest to the absolute edge of the abyss. They are burning their own emotional reserves to the ground to keep others warm, using their brilliance to entirely blind us to the severity of their pain. He was a master illusionist, successfully convincing tens of thousands of people that he was on top of the world while he was actively suffocating beneath it. But a psychological mask, no matter how brilliantly constructed, cannot withstand the heavy, relentless pressure of reality forever. It requires a massive daily expenditure of emotional energy to maintain the illusion of happiness when you are fundamentally broken inside. And when a deeply vulnerable, completely exhausted young man who has outsourced his entire emotional survival to a manufactured persona suddenly encounters a massive real-world trauma, the resulting collapse is absolute. The comedian was running out of breath, his audience was entirely deaf to his reality, and he was desperately searching for a single solid point of gravity in a digital world built entirely on fleeting illusions. He found that gravity in a relationship, placing the absolute entirety of his fragile survival into the hands of another human being, setting the stage for a collision that would completely shatter the mask and force the world to finally, horrifyingly, watch the punchline he never wanted to deliver. The profound exhaustion that accompanies maintaining a massive public deception eventually forces the human mind to seek a sanctuary. When a young man spends every waking hour constructing a digital fortress of humor to guard against a crippling internal depression, the absolute isolation of that existence becomes unsustainable. Frederick Buhl had successfully convinced tens of thousands of strangers that he was a beacon of joy, but the digital applause of a faceless crowd cannot hold a person together in the terrifying quiet of a Seattle apartment at 3 a.m. He desperately required a physical anchor, a tangible human connection strong enough to tether him to the earth when his own mind was actively trying to pull him into the void. In the high-stakes, hyper-connected, and emotionally volatile ecosystem of the underground hip-hop industry, he found that anchor in a young woman named Sochita Sal, a fiercely talented and rapidly rising artist who performed under the aggressive, memorable moniker of Honey Cocaine. Their collision was not merely a standard, fleeting romance between two young creatives. It was a profound psychological event that would ultimately dictate the terms of his survival, and tragically, his demise. The immense, devastating gravity of their relationship was forged in a highly specific cultural and emotional landscape. Honey Cocaine was not a background player. She was an independent, highly driven force in the music industry, heavily affiliated with major West Coast artists, and actively carving out a formidable reputation for herself in a notoriously brutal, male-dominated environment. She possessed a sharp, unyielding exterior, a persona built on resilience and raw talent. For Freddie, a man who was quietly collapsing beneath his own comedic mask, her strength must have appeared as a lifeline. When a deeply fractured individual encounters someone who projects absolute confidence and fierce independence, the initial attraction is rarely just romantic. It is fundamentally survivalist. Beyond a simple desire to share his life with her, he subconsciously sought to hide behind her formidable armor. He was drowning, and she was the only solid ground he could see in a highly superficial industry. As their relationship rapidly intensified, they adopted a specific public label that serves as a massive, glaring psychological warning sign. They began to openly and enthusiastically refer to themselves as Bonnie and Clyde. In the realm of hip-hop culture and youth romance, this historical reference is frequently and dangerously romanticized. It is utilized as the ultimate declaration of loyalty, a stylish metaphor for a couple who will stand together against the entire world. But when you strip away the romanticized gloss of pop culture and examine the actual psychological mechanics of the Bonnie and Clyde dynamic, it is a blueprint for absolute disaster. It is a relationship built entirely on the premise of mutual isolation and extreme toxic codependency. It explicitly implies that the couple does not need external support systems, friends, family, or healthy boundaries. It demands an exclusionary, suffocating closeness where the two individuals essentially merge their identities, drawing a hard line between themselves and the rest of humanity. Most importantly, the historical narrative of Bonnie and Clyde is not a story of enduring love. It is a story of shared trauma, escalating destructive behavior, and an inevitable violent end. By adopting this specific archetype, Freddie was subconsciously establishing a highly dangerous framework where the relationship was viewed as a matter of absolute life and death. Within this intense, isolated dynamic, Freddie executed a deeply fatal psychological maneuver. He effectively tied his entire sense of self-worth and emotional stability to Honey Cocaine, making her the sole anchor for his fragile mental state. This is the terrifying trap of toxic, dependent young love. When a deeply vulnerable person places the absolute entirety of their mental stability into the hands of another human being, they are constructing a ticking time bomb. Freddie was utilizing her love as a direct substitute for the professional psychological help he so desperately required. He weaponized her presence against his own severe depression, using her affection as a daily medication to numb the agonizing reality of his internal world. As long as he had his Bonnie, he did not have to confront the terrifying monsters lurking behind his own comedic mask. He made her responsible for his serotonin, his safety, and his ultimate reason for breathing. However, placing the entire burden of keeping a severely depressed human being alive onto the shoulders of another person is an impossible, fundamentally unfair demand. Honey Cocaine was also incredibly young, barely out of her teenage years, actively trying to build a massive commercial career and navigating the intense pressures of the music industry herself. No single human being, regardless of how deeply they love another, possesses the emotional capacity to serve as the sole psychological life support machine for a partner who is secretly bleeding out internally. The sheer weight of Freddie's unspoken demands, the suffocating intensity of a love that requires constant, unyielding validation just to stave off total psychological collapse, inevitably begins to fracture even the strongest connections. The relationship became a pressure cooker, highly visible to their digital audiences, but deeply, toxically strained behind closed doors. The Bonnie and Clyde illusion requires a flawless, united front, but the reality of two young artists carrying their own individual traumas into a highly codependent space is a recipe for severe emotional friction. The fatal turning point arrived when he fell dangerously in love with Honey Cocaine, a fierce and edgy female rapper. The 22-year-old poured his entire soul into her, but his intense devotion was met with ice-cold detachment. Plagued by rumors of infidelity and feeling completely discarded, Freddie was pushed to the brink. When she finally walked away without a second thought, ignoring his desperate state, that rejection acted as a lethal blade, entirely severing his fragile nervous system. For Honey Cocaine, this was a highly painful, difficult dissolution of a young relationship, a profound heartbreak that she fully intended to survive, process, and eventually move past, as young people are biologically and socially equipped to do. But for Frederick Boole, this event did not register as a standard romantic breakup, because he had entirely fused his identity with hers, because he had designated her as his sole anchor in a terrifying world. The end of the relationship registered in his mind as the definitive, catastrophic end of his entire existence. The loss of his girlfriend on that January day equated to the total destruction of his psychological armor, his emotional life support, and his primary justification for continuing to endure the crushing weight of his own mind. Clinical psychology provides a chilling framework for understanding exactly what happens to the human brain during this type of extreme emotional withdrawal. Neuroimaging studies have conclusively proven that the human brain processes severe emotional rejection utilizing the exact same neural pathways that process agonizing physical pain. When a profoundly codependent individual experiences sudden, total abandonment by their primary emotional anchor, it is not merely a metaphor to say they are in agony. Their central nervous system is entirely flooded with stress hormones, triggering a massive, uncontrollable panic response. For Freddie, whose baseline emotional state was already hovering near the absolute edge of a dark abyss, this sudden withdrawal of his only coping mechanism pushed him completely over the precipice. The withdrawal of love, for a mind that has used it as a narcotic against depression, is exactly as brutal, violent, and physically devastating as the sudden withdrawal of a heavy chemical substance. Stripped of the relationship that he had desperately used to bandage his trauma, Freddie was violently thrown back into the terrifying isolation he had spent years trying to escape. The comedic mask of jerk TV was entirely useless in the face of this absolute internal devastation. He was standing alone in his Seattle apartment, completely defenseless, staring directly into the terrifying void he had successfully ignored while he was playing Clyde. The realization that he was once again entirely alone with the deafening, relentlessly negative voices of his own severe depression was an intolerable concept. The human mind can endure extraordinary amounts of suffering if it believes there is a sanctuary waiting at the end of the ordeal. But Freddie looked into his future and saw only an endless, solitary war against an invincible internal enemy. This is the precise, horrifying moment where the agony of heartbreak violently mutates into a cold, calculated resolution. The panic of abandonment settles into a terrifying absolute certainty. Freddie firmly and tragically decided that a life lived in a state of total emotional isolation, a life where he had to face the crushing weight of his broken soul without the protective shield of his partner, was a fate far worse than the absolute finality of death. His objective shifted from simply stopping the pain of the breakup to permanently silencing a lifelong agony that the breakup had suddenly exposed. He had lost his audience, he had lost his anchor, and he had entirely lost the exhausting will to continue the performance. As the reality of his total solitude settled over him in that quiet apartment, Frederick Boole turned his attention away from the future he could no longer face and directed his focus entirely toward a glowing screen and a cold piece of steel, preparing to invite tens of thousands of strangers to witness the horrifying, inevitable conclusion of a class clown who had finally run out of jokes. The decision to end one's own life is historically an act of profound, agonizing privacy. For centuries, individuals who reached the absolute limits of their emotional endurance would seek out quiet, isolated spaces. They would leave sealed, handwritten notes addressed to a select few, stepping out of the world in silence, deliberately separating their final moments from the gaze of the public. But Frederick Boole belonged to an entirely different generation. He was a digital native, a young man who had built his entire identity, his career, and his social infrastructure within the boundless public architecture of the internet. For Freddie, the concept of a private existence had long since evaporated. His joys, his jokes, his friendships, and his artistry were all public commodities, uploaded and distributed to the masses. Therefore, when the crushing weight of his heartbreak and depression finally pushed him beyond the point of return, he did not reach for a pen and a piece of paper. He reached for his phone. He opened the Twitter application. In a move that perfectly and horrifyingly encapsulates the tragedy of the modern era, he decided to broadcast his own death to an audience of over 70,000 people. He transformed the most intimate, devastating moment of human despair into a live, public feed, initiating a digital death diary that would unfold character by character in real time. To comprehend the profound tragedy of this broadcast, we must first look at the psychological state of a person who chooses to live, tweet their final moments. It is easy and highly inaccurate to dismiss this action as a mere cry for attention. For a young man entirely consumed by isolation, the internet was the only room where he never felt truly alone. The glowing screen was a massive synthetic tether to the rest of humanity. When Freddie began to type his final messages, he was not looking for a rescue. He was looking for witnesses. He was a performer who had spent his entire adult life communicating through a digital lens, and the instinct to document, to share, and to narrate his internal reality was hardwired into his nervous system. He wanted the world to understand the absolute severity of his pain. He wanted to leave a permanent, undeniable record of his suffering, ensuring that his tragedy could not be quietly swept away or misunderstood. He was utilizing the only tool he knew how to wield to exert a final desperate measure of control over a narrative that was rapidly slipping from his grasp. The sequence of messages began with a raw, unfiltered outpouring of grief. Abandoning the polished comedic voice of Jerk TV, he spoke strictly with the terrifying clarity of a man who had made a final, unalterable decision. He tweeted about the coldness of the world, a sentiment reflecting the sudden, brutal withdrawal of his emotional anchor. He spoke of his heartbreak not in the dramatic, poetic terms of a standard hip-hop song, but with a flat, exhausting resignation. He was typing these words while sitting entirely alone in his Seattle apartment, a stark physical contrast to the massive digital crowd he was addressing. With each push of the tweet button, his thoughts were instantly transmitted across the globe, flashing onto the screens of teenagers sitting in classrooms, young adults commuting on trains, and fellow musicians waiting in recording studios. His profound, agonizing human suffering was instantly converted into data, compressed into 140 characters, and injected directly into the endless, scrolling streams of a highly distracted society. As the minutes passed, the tone of his digital diary shifted from abstract sorrow to highly specific, terrifyingly concrete apologies. This is a crucial, heartbreaking phase in the timeline of a suicide. It is the moment where the individual attempts to clean up the emotional wreckage they know they are about to leave behind. Freddie tweeted apologies directly to his mother and his father. He publicly begged for their forgiveness, acknowledging the immense lifelong pain his actions would inflict upon them. These were the words of a young man who possessed a deep, inherent goodness, a son who loved his family but felt entirely powerless against the crushing gravity of his own depression. He was trying to absolve them of any guilt, trying to explain that the disease in his mind had simply overpowered his will to stay. Reading these specific tweets is a profoundly harrowing experience because they completely shatter the illusion of the digital avatar. Behind the screen name and the profile picture was a frightened, exhausted boy saying a desperate, public goodbye to the parents who had raised him. Then the timeline grew darker. The apologies ceased, and the focus shifted entirely to the physical mechanics of his impending death. He began to narrate the presence of a firearm. He tweeted about the weight of the gun, the coldness of the metal. He typed a sentence that remains one of the most chilling artifacts in the history of social media. This barrel never felt so good next to my dome. He explicitly, undeniably stated his immediate intention to pull the trigger. He was no longer speaking in metaphors or expressing general despair. He was providing a live step-by-step commentary of his own execution. At this precise moment, an unprecedented, terrifying sociological phenomenon was occurring. Tens of thousands of human beings were actively watching a young man prepared to shoot himself in the head. They were refreshing their feeds, watching the timestamps on the tweets update in real time. They were reading the explicit, undeniable warnings of an impending suicide. Yet across that massive digital landscape, there was no immediate, overwhelming mobilization to save him. The Seattle Police Department was not instantly paralyzed by a flood of tens of thousands of emergency calls. The internet did not grind to a halt to physically intervene. Instead, the vast majority of the audience simply watched. They read the words, they scrolled, and they remained entirely physically passive. This catastrophic failure of human intervention is a clinical, terrifying manifestation of the bystander effect, and how it is exponentially magnified by the architecture of social media. In traditional sociological studies, the bystander effect occurs when a large group of people witness an emergency in a physical space. The presence of others creates a diffusion of responsibility. Every individual assumes that someone else in the crowd will take the initiative to call for help, resulting in a collective paralysis where absolutely no one acts. Now take that well-documented psychological flaw and apply it to a digital network of 70,000 people scattered across the globe. The diffusion of responsibility is absolute. A teenager reading Freddie's tweets in London assumes that one of Freddie's close friends in Los Angeles is already handling the situation. A fan in New York assumes that the local authorities in Seattle have already been notified. Everyone assumes that someone closer, someone more qualified, or someone with a direct personal connection is actively intervening. The massive size of the digital crowd virtually guaranteed that no individual felt the immediate pressing burden of personal responsibility. Furthermore, the audience was completely paralyzed by the specific nature of Freddie's fame. He was a comedian. He was a man who made his living by subverting expectations, by writing scripts, and by manufacturing engaging digital content. The internet has severely conditioned us to view everything we see on a screen as a performance, a carefully orchestrated attempt to capture our attention and generate engagement. When Freddie tweeted about holding a gun to his head, a massive portion of his audience simply assumed it was a dark, elaborate joke. They believed he was stepping into a new, edgy persona. They thought he was live tweeting a script for a short film or attempting to generate viral buzz for an upcoming music release. This is the tragic, lethal consequence of the boy who cried wolf syndrome applied to the digital age. When a person dedicates their life to entertaining a crowd, the crowd loses the ability to recognize when the performance has stopped and reality has begun. The audience entirely stripped Frederick Boole of his human vulnerability, reducing his genuine, desperate agony into just another piece of content to be consumed, analyzed, and retweeted. The barrier of the screen itself also played a massive role in the collective apathy. A physical screen is a psychological shield. It creates an artificial distance between the observer and the observed, severing the deep biological empathy that occurs when human beings interact face to face. If a young man stands on the ledge of a physical building crying and holding a weapon, the physical reality of the danger triggers an immediate visceral response in the bystanders. They can hear his voice tremble, they can see the terror in his posture, and their basic human instincts compel them to act. But when that exact same emergency is reduced to black text on a white background, sandwiched between a celebrity gossip update and a targeted advertisement for shoes. The human brain struggles to process the reality of the threat. The screen flattens the tragedy. It turns a life or death crisis into a stream of data. The followers reading Freddy's tweets felt a sense of disconnect, an eerie, surreal detachment. They were watching a horror movie play out in text format, failing to fully grasp that the blood about to be spilled was entirely real. As the final minutes approached, the replies beneath Freddy's tweets painted a devastating portrait of digital confusion. Some followers pleaded with him to stop, sending messages of love and support into the void. Others angrily accused him of seeking attention, demanding that he stop making insensitive jokes. Some simply observed, asking what was happening. This chaotic, entirely uncoordinated digital noise was the backdrop to his final moments. He was surrounded by tens of thousands of voices, yet he was dying in absolute, terrifying silence. None of the retweets, the favorites, or the comments could physically reach through the screen and pull the gun away from his head. The internet offered him an infinite audience, but it could not provide a single tangible human hand to hold. Then the digital diary abruptly ended. The final tweet was sent. The timeline stopped updating. In a quiet apartment in Seattle, the violent, deafening crack of a rifle shattered the physical silence. Frederick Boole pulled the trigger, ending his 22 years of life, permanently silencing his pain, and instantly transforming his digital persona into a static digital tombstone. The contrast between the visceral, bloody reality of that room and the sterile, silent updating of Twitter servers in California is a profound testament to the absurdity of the modern human condition. A heart stopped beating. A family was entirely destroyed. A profound talent was extinguished, and the internet simply refreshed the page and moved on to the next trending topic. The aftermath of Freddy's live-tweeted suicide is not just a tragic story about a broken artist. It is a glaring, blaring alarm bell for the entire digital generation. It exposes the absolute failure of our modern communication networks to function as a genuine safety net. We have built an incredibly sophisticated global infrastructure capable of transmitting information at the speed of light, but we have entirely failed to encode human empathy into the algorithm. We have created a society where a person can be intimately connected to 70,000 people and still feel so profoundly, agonizingly isolated that they choose to end their life. The digitalization of human pain is a terrifying progression. When we begin to process the genuine suffering of our fellow human beings as mere content, when we scroll past cries for help because we mistake them for entertainment, we lose a fundamental piece of our own humanity. The tragedy of Frederick Boole forces us to confront the uncomfortable, fragile reality of our own interactions. It demands that we look beyond the curated aesthetics of our social media feeds and recognize the breathing, vulnerable individuals behind the avatars. It challenges us to understand that the people who project the most light, the ones who laugh the loudest and entertain the masses, are frequently the ones fighting the darkest, most exhausting battles in the shadows. We can no longer afford to be passive consumers of each other's lives. We cannot rely on the assumption that someone else in the digital crowd will intervene. The live-tweeted death of a brilliant young comedian is a permanent, heartbreaking reminder that a screen cannot stop a bullet, a retweet cannot heal a broken soul, and an audience of thousands is entirely worthless if not a single person is willing to step out of the digital illusion and into the messy, painful reality of actually saving a life. When the physical reality of the gunshot settled into the agonizing silence of that Seattle apartment, the immediate aftermath did not trigger a profound moral awakening within the corporate structures of the entertainment industry. Instead, it exposed the absolute ruthless coldness of a commercial machine that views young, vulnerable artists not as human beings requiring care, but as heavily leveraged financial assets. The tragedy of Frederick Buell rapidly shifted from a devastating personal loss into a highly volatile public relations crisis for the individuals and brands associated with his digital ascent. The sheer brutality of the music business was laid bare by the immediate, deeply cynical response from the very hip-hop collective that Freddie believed he belonged to. In the years leading up to his death, Freddie had heavily aligned his personal brand and his massive Jerk TV audience with the rapper Tyga and his independent imprint, Last Kings. This was not a casual affiliation. Freddie aggressively promoted the brand, wore their merchandise in his highly viewed videos, prominently featured their logos, and even permanently tattooed the Last Kings insignia onto his own skin. He utilized his immense digital influence to generate significant cultural capital for the label, operating under the deeply held, ultimately fatal illusion that he had been accepted into a genuine artistic brotherhood. He believed he had found a sanctuary, a surrogate family that would protect him from the terrifying isolation of his own mind. However, the modern entertainment complex operates on a ruthless algorithm of profitability and risk mitigation. In the eyes of the industry executives, a young artist is only valuable as long as they are consistently generating revenue, driving positive social media engagement, and maintaining a highly marketable aesthetic. The moment an artist's real, messy, painful human struggles violently spill over into the public domain, the corporate calculus instantly changes. A live-tweeted suicide is not marketable. It is a massive, terrifying liability. Therefore, when the news of Freddie's death broke and the internet began desperately searching for an explanation, the industry immediately activated its defensive protocols. Within hours of the tragedy, Tyga took to Twitter to address the rapidly escalating situation. Bypassing any profound tribute or expression of deep remorse for a fallen friend, he immediately issued a swift, highly clinical, and aggressively defensive disavowal. Tyga explicitly stated to millions of followers that Freddie E. was never officially signed to the Last Kings record label, claiming they barely knew each other and had only spoken a few times. Whether this statement was technically, legally accurate regarding the existence of a formal, binding paper contract is entirely irrelevant to the profound psychological cruelty of the act. The speed and the absolute coldness of the disavowal were staggering. The corporate machine watched a young man bleed to death on a public stage, and its immediate reflexive instinct was to hire lawyers to draft a statement protecting its trademark. This response perfectly and horrifyingly encapsulates the brutal commodification of the modern creator. The industry enthusiastically fed off Freddie's charismatic energy, gladly accepting the free marketing and the cultural relevance his Jerk TV audience provided. They allowed him to wear their name and operate under their banner when the spotlight was bright and the jokes were landing. But the moment his severe clinical depression became a public spectacle, the moment his humanity became a burden, they ruthlessly severed the connection. They essentially stripped the jersey off his back before his body was even cold. This devastating corporate abandonment highlights a terrifying systemic failure within the architecture of modern fame. Young creators are frequently thrust into the blinding, high-pressure spotlight of global internet notoriety, completely devoid of any professional psychological infrastructure. A major record label or a massive digital platform will invest millions of dollars into public relations teams, vocal coaches, wardrobe stylists, and marketing analysts to ensure the absolute perfection of the external product. Yet they will not invest a single dollar into the internal psychiatric well-being of the human being generating the profit. They build a massive, heavily fortified castle around the artist's brand, but leave the artist's mind entirely undefended. When the cameras are finally switched off, when the grueling promotional tours end and the digital crowd logs out, the artist is left standing completely alone in an empty room. They are left to fight terrifying, heavily amplified internal monsters that the industry actively helped feed with massive doses of artificial validation, but absolutely refuses to help them slay. FREDDY E was a casualty of a system that extracts a young person's soul for content and discards the empty vessel the moment it cracks. The agonizing burden of dealing with this discarded vessel fell entirely upon his family. Frederick Bull Sr., Freddie's father, was suddenly forced to navigate a landscape of grief that is entirely incomprehensible to previous generations. He did not simply lose his 22-year-old son to an unpredictable medical illness or a tragic, unavoidable physical accident. He lost his son to a silent, highly complex internal war that ultimately culminated on a massive public stage, witnessed by tens of thousands of strangers who treated the death of his child as an interactive digital event. The father was left to sort through the physical wreckage of the Seattle apartment, while simultaneously watching the digital ghost of his son be endlessly dissected, mocked, and misrepresented across the internet. In his public statements following the tragedy, the profound, unyielding agony of a parent who outlives their child was palpable. He spoke of Freddie's brilliant mind, his inherent goodness, and the devastating reality that the family was completely unaware of the absolute severity of the darkness consuming him. His grief is a permanent, heartbreaking testament to the fact that while the internet quickly consumes a tragedy and moves on to the next trending topic within 48 hours, the family is sentenced to a lifetime of waking up every single morning to an empty room and a terrifying, unanswered question of why. The historical context of Frederick Bull's death elevates this tragedy from an isolated incident into a glaring, blaring alarm bell for an entire generation. His suicide did not occur in a cultural vacuum. It was part of a terrifying, undeniable cluster of highly public digital tragedies. Just 12 days prior to Freddie pulling the trigger in Seattle, on the night of December 24th, 2012, another brilliant, highly influential young hip-hop artist named Capital Steez stepped off a rooftop in Manhattan, also utilizing Twitter to broadcast his final definitive message to the world. Two brilliant minds, two fiercely independent artists, two young men possessing the immense cultural power to shape the minds of millions of teenagers, both choosing to violently exit the physical world within a 2-week window, and both utilizing the exact same social media platform to narrate their demise. This was absolutely not a bizarre statistical anomaly. These consecutive deaths were massive, flashing red lights warning of a profound systemic epidemic. An entire generation of young artists was being systematically crushed by the deadly, unregulated intersection of sudden digital fame, extreme industry pressure, and completely unaddressed, highly stigmatized mental health crises. The system was failing them at every conceivable level. From this immense, seemingly insurmountable pain, however, a vital, actionable lesson must be aggressively extracted. We can no longer afford to view the tragedy of Freddie E. as a passive historical cautionary tale. We must fundamentally restructure the way we interact with the people in our own immediate circles. We must actively implement a psychological protocol that can be best described as a spirit transfusion. In modern society, we are heavily conditioned to respect boundaries, to give people space, and to wait for individuals to explicitly ask for help before we intervene. But the biological nature of severe clinical depression ensures that the victim will almost never ask for a life jacket. Depression actively convinces the host that they are a burden, that their pain is entirely invalid, and that the world would be fundamentally better off without their presence. Therefore, waiting for a depressed person to reach out is a lethal strategy. When you see someone, especially the strong ones, the fiercely independent ones, the ones who always project absolute confidence, and most importantly, the class clowns who use humor to deflect any serious inquiry into their well-being, beginning to falter, you cannot stand by as a passive, polite observer. A spirit transfusion requires you to violently breach the polite boundaries of modern social interaction. It requires you to actively, forcefully interject your own psychological strength, your own unyielding presence into their life. You do not wait for the invitation. You step directly into the darkness with them. When their spirit is failing, when their internal dialogue consists entirely of self-destruction, you literally transfer your own energy to them. You sit in the room, you force the conversation, and you refuse to accept the comedic deflection. You look the class clown directly in the eye, and you acknowledge the profound, exhausting weight of the mask they are wearing. You make it absolutely, undeniably clear that your love and your presence are not conditional upon their ability to entertain you. This psychological imperative leads directly to a simple yet profoundly necessary call to action that every single person listening to this narrative can execute today. We must initiate the Sign It Freddie E campaign in our own personal lives. The legacy of Freddie E demands a terrifying audit of our own immediate social circles. It forces a glaring spotlight onto the person who always makes the loudest jokes, the individual whose social media feed is a constant, gilly, curated stream of entertainment and forced positivity. The tragedy dictates that reaching out to that specific highly curated stream of entertainment and forced positivity. The tragedy dictates that reaching out to that specific person, shattering the superficial script, and explicitly acknowledging the human being behind the performance is no longer a polite gesture, but a biological imperative. It is a permanent, heavy reminder that waiting for the punchline can be fatal and completely shatter the superficial script. Tell them explicitly that you see the human being behind the performance. Tell them that you are ready to sit in absolute silence and listen When the jokes finally stop, tell them that they do not have to be funny to be worthy of survival. And when you send that message, sign that mental commitment, Freddie E. Use his name as a permanent, heavy reminder of the catastrophic cost of our collective silence. Use his legacy to ensure that you never allow another brilliant light in your life to quietly extinguish itself while you are waiting for the punchline. The tragic, violent end of Frederick Eugene Bull is not simply a dark footnote in the early history of internet culture, nor is it merely a sensationalized tale of celebrity despair. It is a harsh, unyielding, and necessary test of our collective human compassion in an era defined by artificial connection. It forces us to ask a terrifying question. Have we allowed the glowing screens in our hands to entirely numb our biological empathy? The laughter he brought to the world was genuine, but it could not serve as a bulletproof vest against a broken soul. The ultimate tragedy of Freddie E. is that he died entirely surrounded by a massive crowd, yet completely alone. It is our absolute, uncompromising responsibility to ensure that when the next class clown drops the act, lowers their defenses, and silently cries for help, we do not stare at the screen and passively wait for the next act. We break the glass, we reach through the digital noise, and we aggressively pull them back from the edge.